The temperature outside had fallen so low that even the horses in Judith Basin refused to leave their shelters. Yet inside a lonely cabin on the edge of the Montana prairie, heat still radiated from a giant brick stove long after the fire had died. When 3 desperate knocks struck the door on the 8th night of the blizzard, Caleb Voss already knew who stood outside. The man begging for help was the same brother who had once forced him to leave everything behind. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But the story of that knock began many months earlier. Spring arrived late in Judith Basin in 1888. The snow had finally retreated from the fields, leaving behind wet soil and wagon ruts deep enough to swallow a boot. Across the valley, farmers talked about new opportunities, better grazing, more cattle, more profit. Caleb Voss listened to those conversations but rarely joined them. At 47 years old, he had earned a reputation for thinking too far ahead. While other men celebrated a good season, Caleb worried about the next bad one. If rainfall was generous, he stored extra grain. If prices were strong, he saved money instead of spending it. His older brother Abram saw things differently. The family farm belonged to both of them after their father's death. On paper, they were partners. In practice, they had become opponents. Abram believed success came from expansion, more livestock, more land, more production. Caleb believed survival came from preparation, stronger buildings, larger reserves, fewer risks. Neither man hated the other. That made the conflict harder. They shared blood, memories, and years of working side by side. But every decision seemed to pull them farther apart. One evening, after finishing repairs on a barn roof, the brothers stood overlooking the western fields. The sun hung low above the horizon. Abe folded his arms. You spend your life preparing for disasters that never come. Caleb kept his eyes on the distant hills. And what happens when one finally does? Abram laughed. What happens is we waste opportunities while waiting for ghosts. The conversation ended there, but neither man forgot it. Over the next several weeks, disagreements multiplied. A new cattle purchase, a larger hay shed, repairs to aging structures. Every choice became an argument about the future. The tension reached Martha Voss before anyone admitted it. Martha had spent 20 years watching the brothers work together. Now she watched them avoid each other at supper. She watched silence replace conversation, and she watched worry settle deeper into Caleb's face with every passing day. One night, after Abram had left the house, she found Caleb sitting alone at the kitchen table. A rough sketch lay in front of him. Strange lines, measurements, brick shapes, channels winding through a large central structure. What is it? Martha asked. Caleb hesitated. A stove. She stared at the drawing. It looks big enough to build a house around. A faint smile crossed his face. Maybe that's the point. Martha did not laugh. Their savings were already thin. The previous harvest had been disappointing. Several pieces of equipment still carried unpaid balances. Whatever Caleb was imagining, it looked expensive, very expensive. Yet something in his expression unsettled her. He wasn't daydreaming. He was planning. Days later, the situation exploded. Abram called a meeting inside the farmhouse. The discussion lasted less than an hour. When it ended, Caleb walked outside, carrying nothing but a folded document and a face drained of color. Martha met him on the porch. What happened? For several seconds he said nothing. Then he handed her the paper. The agreement transferred the main farm operations entirely to Abram. In exchange, Caleb would receive a smaller parcel of land north of the basin. Poor soil, few improvements, almost no existing structures, a place most farmers had avoided for years. Martha read the document twice, then a third time. He can't be serious. He is. You agreed to this? Caleb looked toward the fading horizon. No, his voice remained calm. But it happened anyway. For the first time in years, uncertainty crept into his eyes. Not fear for himself, fear for the future. The next morning, neighbors watched as wagons were loaded. Tools, furniture, supplies, everything the family still owned. Some offered sympathy, others offered curiosity. Most simply watched. Among them stood Abram, silent, unmoving, certain he had made the practical choice. As the wagon rolled away from the only home they had known for years, Martha turned once and looked back. Caleb never did. Ahead of them waited poor land, shrinking savings, and an uncertain future. But hidden beneath a folded blanket in the wagon sat the strange stove sketch. And before the week was over, Finnick would discover something on that barren piece of land that would change not only his family's fate, but the fate of everyone in Judith Basin when winter finally came. The parcel north of Judith Basin looked worse up close. The soil was thin and rocky. A seasonal creek cut through part of the property, but even in spring it carried less water than Finnick had hoped. Most settlers would have called the land a mistake. Some already had. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Martha climbed down and stared across the open ground. No barn, no shed, no fencing worth keeping, just wind, a cold wind that never seemed to rest. Behind her, Finnick stood quietly for several moments, then he nodded once. "We can work with this." Martha wished she shared his confidence. Over the following weeks, they worked from sunrise until darkness swallowed the prairie. The first priority was shelter. Finnick selected a slightly elevated section near a stand of ponderosa pines. The location offered some protection from the strongest western winds, not enough to stop them completely, just enough to matter. Every day brought another problem. A wagon wheel cracked. A load of timber arrived short. A sudden rainstorm soaked supplies left outside. Money disappeared faster than either of them expected. Martha kept track of every dollar in a small notebook. Each evening she sat by lantern light and updated the numbers. Each evening the totals looked worse. One night she stared at the page for a long time before finally speaking. "If we keep spending like this, we'll barely have enough for winter supplies." Finnick looked up from a rough drawing spread across the table. "I know, you keep saying that." "Because I do." Martha's eyes moved to the sketch, the strange stove again. The giant brick structure seemed to appear in every version of his plans. A normal iron stove would cost less, take less space, require less work. Almost everyone used one. Yet Finnick refused to remove the drawing. "Tell me honestly," she said quietly. "Do we really need this?" For the first time that evening he stopped working. Then he looked toward the dark window. "I think someday we'll need it more than anything else on this property." Martha didn't argue, but the answer failed to comfort her. By midsummer the cabin finally stood, small, simple, strong enough to survive ordinary weather. Most people would have celebrated. Finnick immediately began planning the stove. Word spread quickly. It always did in small communities. The first visitor arrived 3 days later. Caleb Mercer rode over on horseback carrying supplies. He studied the growing stacks of salvaged brick beside the cabin. "You building a chimney or a courthouse?" Finnick smiled faintly. "A stove." Caleb laughed. "A stove?" He walked around the pile. "You could heat 3 cabins with that much brick, maybe. You know winter's still months away, right?" Finnick nodded. "That's exactly why I'm building it now." Caleb shook his head. The conversation remained friendly, but the doubt lingered after he left. Others followed. Jeremiah Boone, the local blacksmith. Silas Crow, who sold firewood throughout the basin. Ruth Mercer, several neighboring settlers. Each reaction sounded slightly different. The meaning stayed the same. Too expensive, too large, too risky, too late. Martha heard every comment. Some of them bothered her because they sounded reasonable. One evening she found herself calculating the cost of flour, lamp oil, and winter provisions again. The numbers refused to cooperate. When Finnick walked inside carrying another load of reclaimed brick, she finally lost her patience. "We don't even know if this thing will work." The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence filled the cabin. Finnick set down the brick. For a moment Martha regretted speaking. Then he surprised her. "I don't know either." That wasn't the answer she expected. He sat across from her. His face looked older than it had a year ago. More tired, more weathered. "I've seen something like it before," he said, "a long time ago." He explained how an immigrant stonemason working on a railroad crew had once heated an entire bunkhouse using stored heat instead of constant flames. The memory had never left him. Neither had the lesson. Most people heated air, the old mason heated stone, and stone remembered. Martha listened carefully. For the first time she realized this project wasn't stubbornness, it was belief. Maybe even faith. That frightened her more than failure, because people often sacrificed everything for things they believed in. Construction continued, brick by brick, layer by layer. Weeks passed. Savings shrank. The cabin slowly transformed around the enormous masonry structure rising at its center. Meanwhile, signs of trouble appeared elsewhere. One afternoon, Caleb stopped by carrying an armful of fence boards. The conversation drifted toward weather. The geese started moving south early, he said. Finnick looked up immediately. How early? Couple weeks earlier than usual. The answer seemed to bother him. Later that evening, he climbed onto the cabin roof and spent nearly an hour studying the horizon. Martha watched from below. What are you looking for? Patterns. You can see patterns from up there? Sometimes. The reply sounded strange, yet she knew better than to dismiss him. Finnick paid attention to things most people ignored. 3 days before the storm, the first real warning arrived. The morning felt oddly warm, too warm. Even the animals seemed restless. Horses paced, cattle gathered together near shelter, birdsong nearly vanished. Finnick noticed every detail. That evening he checked every window seal in the cabin, then every door, then every stack of firewood. Martha watched quietly. The old anxiety had returned, the same anxiety Abram had always criticized. Preparation, always preparation. 48 hours before the storm, another problem appeared, a thin crack. It ran along one section of the masonry near the upper channel. Not large, not catastrophic, but impossible to ignore. Finnick stared at it for several seconds. Martha saw the color drain from his face. How bad? He didn't answer immediately. That worried her more than the crack itself. Finally he said, I don't know. The words hung in the room. Outside, the wind had started to rise. Inside, the unfinished stove stood silent in the center of the cabin. For the first time since leaving the farm, Finnick looked uncertain. Then another sound echoed through the evening. A horse approaching fast, too fast. Someone rode hard into the yard. Finnick stepped outside. Abram sat in the saddle. His face looked grim. He barely waited for greetings. The weather office in Helena just sent word, he said. A major Arctic front is coming. Finnick felt the cold before the temperature had even begun to fall. Then Abram looked past him toward the cracked masonry stove and asked the one question neither Finnick nor Martha wanted to hear. Tell me that's ready. Abram did not repeat the question. He didn't need to. The silence that followed said enough. Finnick looked toward the crack running across the upper section of the masonry. In the fading light, it seemed larger than it had an hour earlier. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe fear was simply making it easier to see. No, Finnick finally answered. Not ready. Abram exhaled through his nose. The wind tugged at his coat. Then you'd better make it ready fast. For a moment, old resentment flickered between them, not anger, something deeper. Months earlier, Abram had pushed his brother off the family farm because he believed Finnick's preparations were wasting resources. Now he stood in the yard warning him about the very disaster Finnick had spent his life preparing for. Neither man mentioned the irony. Abram climbed back onto his horse. The forecast says temperatures could drop 40 degrees in less than a day. Martha stepped closer. How sure are they? Abram looked toward the darkening western horizon. Sure enough, then he rode away. The wind followed him. That night nobody slept much. Finnick remained beside the stove long after Martha went to bed. A lantern burned beside him while he inspected every section of masonry. The crack bothered him. Not because it was large, because he didn't fully understand why it had appeared. That uncertainty felt dangerous. Near midnight he finally found the cause. One portion of the outer masonry had settled unevenly during curing. The pressure had concentrated in a single area. Repairable, but only if he worked immediately. By dawn he had already started. Martha woke to the sound of tools. When she stepped outside, Finnick was removing part of the affected section. You haven't slept. Not yet. You need rest. I need this stove. The answer ended the discussion. Throughout the day, clouds thickened. The sky slowly changed color. By afternoon, the blue had disappeared completely. Everything felt gray, heavy, waiting. Neighbors began preparing. Caleb Mercer spent the day hauling additional firewood indoors. Jeremiah Boone closed his forge early and started reinforcing shutters. Silas Crow canceled deliveries for the first time anyone could remember. The basin was holding its breath. Late that evening, Finnick completed the repair. The crack was gone. The masonry looked solid again. But another challenge remained. The stove had never been fired. No matter how carefully he had built it, no matter how much faith he placed in the design, it remained unproven. Martha understood the weight of that reality. You still have to test it, Finnick nodded. Tomorrow. The word hung over both of them. Outside, the wind continued rising, 24 hours before the storm. The next morning arrived strangely warm enough that several patches of snow softened instead of freezing, warm enough to feel wrong. Finnick gathered dry pine and stacked it beside the firebox. Martha watched quietly. This moment had lived in his mind for months. Now it was finally here. The first fire. Finnick lit the kindling. Small flames flickered to life, then larger ones followed. At first, everything seemed normal. The fire pulled steadily. Smoke moved upward. Heat began entering the masonry. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Hope slowly entered the room, then the wind shifted. The change happened almost instantly. A powerful gust slammed against the cabin, the draft faltered, the fire hesitated, and suddenly smoke poured back into the room. Martha reacted first. Finnick! Grey clouds spread across the cabin ceiling. Within seconds the air thickened. Finnick opened the firebox. The mistake only made things worse. More smoke rolled outward. His stomach dropped. Not now. Not after everything. Not today. He threw open the front door. Cold air rushed inside. The smoke escaped, but so did precious heat. Outside, the first snowflakes had begun to fall. Small, sparse, a warning. Not the storm itself, just its messenger. By afternoon the cabin smelled of soot. The walls carried faint black stains. The stove sat silent. Failure seemed to fill the room. Martha said nothing. That hurt more than criticism. Finnick walked outside and stared at the chimney. His mind replayed every step of construction, every measurement, every decision. Somewhere he had been wrong. The question was where. As darkness approached, footsteps crunched through fresh snow. Caleb arrived first. Jeremiah followed shortly afterward. News traveled fast, especially bad news. Neither man mocked him. That almost made it worse. They simply looked at the stove, then looked at him. Jeremiah crossed his arms. Draft problem. Finnick nodded. I know. You know where? No. The blacksmith studied the chimney. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then Jeremiah pointed upward, the ridge. Finnick followed his finger. The realization hit immediately. The chimney terminated below a turbulent airflow zone created by the roofline and prevailing wind direction. Not a problem during calm weather, a major problem during storms. The stove itself wasn't failing, the chimney was. Relief arrived so quickly it almost made him dizzy. For the first time all day he smiled. The repair required extra pipe, a section he did not have. Caleb glanced toward the dark sky. Stores closed, so is the road, Jeremiah added. Silence returned. The storm was already beginning. Without the additional pipe, there would be no second test. Without a second test, nobody knew whether the stove would work. Then Martha disappeared into the cabin. A few minutes later she returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. Finnick immediately recognized it. A silver pocket watch, one of the last valuable things they still owned. His father's watch. Martha held it out. No, she ignored him. We need the pipe, it's all we have left, then that's exactly what it's for. The words hit harder than any argument. This wasn't just money, this was trust, faith, sacrifice. Martha was choosing the stove over security, choosing Finnick over certainty. Jeremiah accepted the watch quietly. I've got spare pipe at my shop. Finnick looked at him. You don't have to. Yes, Jeremiah interrupted. I do. The blacksmith left immediately. Snow followed him into the darkness. Hours later, he returned carrying the missing section. Together, they worked by lantern light. Wind hammered the cabin. Snow thickened. Temperatures plunged. The repair finished shortly after midnight. Nobody celebrated. The real test still remained. Finnick stood alone before the stove. The new chimney section rose higher into the storm. Outside, the world had begun turning white. Inside, every hope they had rested on what happened next. He reached for a match, then froze. Something had caught his eye near the base of the masonry, a small metal box, hidden behind one of the clean-out doors. He had never seen it before, never installed it, never placed it there. Slowly he pulled it free. The box was old, rust-covered, and engraved with a single letter, his father's initial, FV. Finnick stared at it as the storm screamed outside, because his father had died years before this cabin was ever built. So how had his father's hidden box ended up inside a stove that didn't exist when the old man was alive? Finnick turned the metal box over in his hands. The rust was thick along the edges, but the engraved initials remained clear. FV, his father's initials. There was no mistake. Jeremiah stepped closer and held up the lantern. What is that? Finnick didn't answer immediately. The question that troubled him wasn't what the box was, it was how it had gotten there. The stove stood in a cabin his father had never seen. The old man had died years before Finnick ever set foot on this property. Yet somehow, something that belonged to him had been hidden inside masonry that hadn't existed during his lifetime. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. Inside, everyone stared at the box. "Open it," Martha finally said. Finnick hesitated, then he carefully lifted the corroded latch. The hinge resisted at first, then gave way. Inside lay several folded papers wrapped in oilcloth. Nothing else. No money, no valuables. Just documents. Finnick felt disappointment and curiosity arrive at the same time. The papers looked old. Very old. He unfolded the first one. His father's handwriting stared back at him. The sight hit harder than expected. For a moment the cabin disappeared, not into a flashback. Into memory. The familiar handwriting, the careful lettering, the man who rarely wasted words. Martha immediately recognized it too. Her hand moved to her mouth. "That's his writing," Finnick nodded. The first document appeared to be an inventory list. Land boundaries, livestock counts, equipment records, nothing unusual. The second document changed that. His expression tightened. Jeremiah noticed immediately. "What is it?" Finnick read the page again. Then a third time. The paper wasn't an inventory, it was a legal statement, unsigned, undated, incomplete, yet the words were unmistakable. "If circumstances require division of the Voss property, the northern parcel shall remain attached to the inheritance of my younger son." Silence filled the cabin. Abram had received the main farm. Finnick had been pushed onto the northern parcel. At first glance, the statement seemed to support what eventually happened. Then Finnick reached the final line, and stopped. "The northern parcel shall not be sold, transferred, or absorbed into the primary operation without written consent from both heirs." Jeremiah frowned. "What does that mean?" Finnick already knew. His stomach tightened. "It means Abram couldn't legally take full control without my agreement." Martha looked up sharply. "But he did, yes." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, snow struck the windows harder. The storm was arriving. Inside, a different storm had begun. Finnick reached for the final document. This one was folded separately, protected more carefully than the others. The paper crackled softly as he opened it. A letter, addressed to both sons. His father's handwriting appeared across the top. "If either of you are reading this, then circumstances have likely become difficult." Finnick swallowed. The words felt strangely alive. The letter continued. It spoke about responsibility, preparation, the danger of pride, the obligation brothers owed each other. Nothing surprising at first. Then came a passage that changed everything. Abram noticed it too, because at that exact moment, another series of knocks rattled the cabin door. 3 hard knocks, urgent, desperate. The men exchanged glances. Nobody expected visitors in weather like this. Finnick folded the letter. Jeremiah grabbed the lantern. The knocking came again, louder. Martha moved toward the door first. Finnick stopped her. "I'll do it." When he opened the door, wind exploded into the room, snow swirled through the entrance. A figure stumbled inside, then another, then a third, Caleb Mercer, his wife Ruth. And behind them, Silas Crow. All 3 looked exhausted. Ice covered their coats. Their faces were pale from the cold. Silas nearly collapsed against the wall. "The roads are gone," he said between breaths. "The storm's worse than forecast." Caleb nodded grimly. "My chimney draft keeps failing." Jeremiah immediately understood. The wind patterns had shifted, exactly the kind of conditions that exposed weaknesses in ordinary heating systems. "How cold?" Finnick asked. Silas looked toward the window. Already below 20, everyone fell silent. It wasn't even the first night. The temperature would continue dropping, much lower. The newcomers settled near the center of the room while Martha prepared coffee. Nobody discussed pride. Nobody discussed past disagreements. The storm was stripping away those luxuries. Survival came first. Eventually Caleb noticed the papers spread across the table. His eyes narrowed. "What's all this?" Finnick looked at the documents, then at Abram. For a moment he considered saying nothing, keeping the discovery private, but something stopped him. Maybe the storm, maybe the years of resentment, maybe the letter itself. He handed the legal statement across the table. Caleb read it, then frowned. So according to this, the land split wasn't supposed to happen that way. Abram remained quiet, too quiet. Finnick noticed, so did Martha. The silence felt different now. Not defensive. Uneasy, as if Abram recognized something. Finally, Finnick looked directly at his brother. "Did father ever show you these?" Abram's face changed, just slightly. But enough, the room noticed. The wind pounded the walls. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Abram slowly looked down at the table. "I thought he burned them." Finnick froze. "What?" Abram stared at the lantern flame. For the first time since arriving, he looked older. Not physically, emotionally, like a man carrying something heavy for a very long time. "He gave me a box before he died." The room fell silent again. Martha's eyes widened. Jeremiah leaned forward. Finnick felt his pulse quicken. "A box?" Abram nodded. "I opened it after the funeral." His voice had become almost a whisper. There were letters, legal papers, instructions. Snow hammered the cabin. The stove waited silently beside them, and for the first time, Finnick realized the conflict between them might never have started with the land itself. It might have started with whatever had been inside that original box. Abram slowly lifted his eyes, then spoke the words Finnick never expected to hear. "I wasn't the only person who saw those papers." The room went still, because suddenly the mystery wasn't about what Abram had done. It was about who else had known. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The storm battered the cabin walls with growing violence. Snow hissed across the windows. The temperature was dropping fast, but inside the room another pressure had taken hold. Abram stared into the lantern flame. Finnick watched him carefully. "Who else?" he asked. Abram didn't answer. "Who else saw the papers?" Still nothing. The silence stretched long enough to become its own confession. Finally Martha stepped forward. "After everything that's happened, you don't get to keep protecting them." Abram closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not courage, exhaustion. "The lawyer." The answer surprised everyone. Jeremiah frowned. "What lawyer?" "Harold Granger." Finnick immediately recognized the name. Granger had handled several property transfers throughout the basin for years. He had managed wills, deeds, and inheritance paperwork for dozens of local families, including theirs. Abram rubbed his forehead. "Father gave me the box after he got sick. He told me to bring it to Granger if anything happened to him." "Did you?" Finnick asked. "Yes." The room fell silent again. Finnick felt anger rising. Not hot anger. Cold anger. The dangerous kind. "What happened?" Abram looked toward the floor. "At first, nothing." "That's not an answer, I know." Outside, the wind slammed into the cabin hard enough to make the structure groan. Inside, nobody moved. Abram continued. "Granger reviewed everything, the will, the land records, the instructions, and he said father was making things complicated." Finnick laughed once. A short, bitter sound. That sounded exactly like something their father would do. Complicated usually meant careful. Careful usually meant prepared. Prepared usually annoyed people who preferred shortcuts. Abram nodded slowly. He kept saying the land division didn't make practical sense. The legal statement on the table suddenly carried new weight. Finnick glanced down at it. The northern parcel. The same parcel everyone considered nearly worthless. The same parcel Granger apparently disliked. The same parcel Finnick now owned. Something about that bothered him. A lot. "Why would he care?" Caleb asked. Abram hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know," but the answer sounded weak. Even he didn't believe it. The storm worsened. By midnight, the wind had become a living thing outside. The cabin creaked under repeated gusts. Snow piled against the walls. Visibility disappeared entirely. Nobody was leaving until conditions improved, which meant there was nowhere to escape the conversation. Hours passed. Coffee was replaced with silence. Then silence was replaced by questions. The letter from their father remained on the table. Eventually Finnick unfolded it again. This time he read further. The final paragraphs had been hidden beneath the fold. His expression changed immediately. Martha noticed. "So what does it say?" Finnick swallowed, then read aloud. "If circumstances ever make the northern parcel seem less valuable than the main farm, remember that appearances have misled men before." The room went quiet. The letter continued. "The future of this family may one day depend on what lies beneath that land." Jeremiah looked up sharply. "What lies beneath it?" Finnick kept reading. But the next line provided no answer, only another warning. "Trust documents less than character and character less than proof." Then the letter ended. No explanation, no details, nothing, only questions. The room erupted. What does that mean? What was he talking about? Beneath the land? Minerals? Water? Nobody knew, yet one fact became impossible to ignore. Their father had attached unusual importance to a parcel everyone else considered worthless, including Abram. Especially Abram, the realization visibly unsettled him. Because if the old man had been right, then the decision to push Finnick onto that land might have carried consequences nobody understood. A little later, while the others settled into uneasy rest, Finnick remained awake. The stove still hadn't been tested. The discovery of the documents had distracted everyone. The storm had not. It continued advancing, relentless, unforgiving. Around 2 in the morning he finally stood. Martha noticed immediately. "Where are you going?" To light the stove, she looked toward the windows. Now. He couldn't wait any longer, neither could the weather. Jeremiah joined him without being asked. Caleb followed. Soon everyone was gathered around the massive masonry structure. Months of labor, months of sacrifice. Everything rested on what happened next. Finnick struck the match. The flame caught quickly. Dry pine crackled. Small orange light filled the firebox. Nobody spoke. The draft pulled upward. Steady, clean. The repaired chimney appeared to be working. For several minutes hope returned. Then another problem emerged, a strange sound deep inside the masonry, a dull pop. Then another. Martha's heart nearly stopped. Jeremiah immediately crouched beside the stove. What was that? Nobody answered. A third sound echoed through the structure. The room froze. Finnick felt his stomach tighten. Thermal expansion. The bricks were adjusting to heat normal. At least he hoped it was normal. The uncertainty was brutal. Another minute passed, then another. No new sounds. The draft remained stable. The fire burned clean. Slowly warmth began entering the masonry. Relief spread through the room. Not complete relief, just enough. By dawn, the storm had reached full strength. The fire had long since burned down, yet the stove remained warm, very warm. Martha rested her hand against the stone. Her eyes widened. The heat remained. Hours after the flames were gone. Jeremiah noticed it too. So did Caleb. For the first time, nobody joked about the size of the stove. Nobody called it wasteful. Nobody called it foolish. The room felt different. The warmth felt different. And then came another surprise. A loud crash echoed outside. Everyone rushed toward the door. Finnick forced it open against the wind. Snow immediately blew inside. Across the yard, something had collapsed. Part of the old storage shed. The structure folded under drifting snow. Timbers snapped. The roof disappeared beneath white drifts. Martha stared at the wreckage. If they had delayed construction another season, if they had spent money on anything else, if they had chosen comfort over preparation, the cabin might never have existed. The stove might never have existed. None of them said it aloud. They didn't need to. The storm was saying it for them. Later that morning, as the wind briefly eased, Abram sat alone at the table studying the recovered documents. Something continued bothering him. Finnick could see it. Finally, Abram reached into his coat. His movements slowed, almost reluctant. Then he pulled out a folded paper, old, yellowed, carefully preserved. I wasn't going to show anyone this. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Abram unfolded the document. It wasn't part of the recovered box. It was something else. Something he had kept hidden for years. Finnick immediately recognized Harold Granger's signature at the bottom. His pulse quickened. What is it? Abram looked directly at him. His face had gone pale. It's the page that disappeared from Father's file. The room fell completely silent. Then Abram spoke the words that changed everything. And according to this document, Father never intended either of us to own the northern parcel. The words landed harder than the storm outside. Nobody spoke. The stove continued releasing steady warmth into the cabin, but the room suddenly felt colder. Finnick stared at the document in Abram's hands. What do you mean he never intended either of us to own it? Abram swallowed. His fingers tightened around the paper. I mean exactly what I said. Slowly he handed it across the table. Finnick took it. The paper was older than most legal documents he had seen. The edges had yellowed with age. Harold Granger's signature appeared at the bottom, along with a faded witness seal. The language was formal, complicated. But the meaning became clear after the second reading. The northern parcel was never meant to be part of the standard inheritance. It was supposed to remain under a separate trust arrangement until a specific condition was met. Finnick looked up. What condition? Abram shook his head. That's the problem. The page is incomplete. Jeremiah stepped closer. What do you mean incomplete? The bottom section is missing. The room fell silent again. Someone had physically removed part of the document, not torn by accident, cut, cleanly, deliberately. Finnick examined the lower edge. Abram was right. The missing section had been removed with precision. Someone had wanted the condition hidden. The realization settled heavily over everyone present, because people did not alter inheritance records without a reason, and they certainly didn't hide them for decades without a bigger reason. Outside, another powerful gust slammed into the cabin. Snow rattled against the windows. Inside, Caleb leaned forward. Who had access to the original file? Abram didn't hesitate. Granger, and Abram looked uncomfortable. Father, anyone else? A long pause followed. Then Abram answered. One more person. Every eye turned toward him. Finnick already hated the look on his brother's face, because it wasn't the expression of someone remembering. It was the expression of someone admitting. Who? Abram stared at the table. My wife. The silence deepened. Martha blinked. Sarah? Abram nodded. She was helping organize father's paperwork after he got sick. Finnick leaned back slowly. Sarah. For years she had managed records, finances, correspondence, and legal notices around the main farm. Nothing unusual about that, except now every memory felt different. Every conversation, every decision, every argument about land. The storm howled. The cabin listened, and suddenly Sarah's name sat at the center of everything. Caleb broke silence. Did she ever mention the trust? No. The missing section unusual? Abram's answer came slower this time. Maybe. Everyone waited. His eyes drifted toward the window. Years seemed to settle onto his shoulders. A few weeks after father's funeral, she told me something. What? Abram exhaled heavily. She said the northern parcel would eventually become worthless. Finnick frowned. Why would she think that? Because Granger told her. Jeremiah's expression darkened. The blacksmith wasn't a lawyer, but he knew enough to recognize a conflict of interest when he saw one. And what exactly did Granger claim? Abram laughed bitterly. That the land couldn't support real farming. Finnick looked around the cabin. The irony was impossible to ignore. Everyone in the room was currently surviving on that supposedly worthless land. The stove, the cabin, the timber, the protected ridge. Everything existed because of the parcel nobody wanted. Martha folded her arms. That still doesn't explain why someone removed part of a legal document. No, Finnick said quietly, it doesn't. The room settled into uneasy silence. Hours passed, the storm intensified. Nobody could leave, nobody could escape the questions. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped even further. Caleb checked the thermometer near the window. His face tightened. 38 below. Nobody responded. The number spoke for itself. Under normal circumstances, conditions like that could kill people quickly. Yet the cabin remained warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just warm. The giant masonry stove continued radiating heat from every side. Even Jeremiah seemed fascinated now. Several times he walked around it, placing a hand against different sections. Each time the temperature remained remarkably consistent. The heat wasn't disappearing. It was being stored, exactly as Finnick had hoped. For the first time, Martha allowed herself to believe the sacrifice had been worth it. Not because of the money, because of what it meant. Preparation wasn't fear. Preparation was protection. There was a difference. A few hours later, while the others rested, Finnick returned to the recovered documents. Something bothered him. The trust arrangement, the missing condition, the hidden box. None of it fit together. Then he noticed something unusual. A faint indentation near the bottom of one page. Not writing, pressure marks, as if someone had written on a sheet placed above it. His pulse quickened. He carried the document toward the lantern, tilting it carefully, watching shadows form across the surface, there, very faint, almost invisible. A word, then another. Martha joined him. What is it? I'm not sure. The marks were difficult to read. Years of age had nearly erased them, but not completely. He adjusted the angle again. The letters slowly emerged. Jeremiah moved closer. Then Caleb. The entire room gathered around the lantern. Finnick read the first word aloud. Survey. Another word appeared beneath it. Deposit. His heartbeat accelerated. The next line was harder. Almost gone. He leaned closer. The word finally emerged. Silver. Nobody spoke. The storm vanished from Finnick's awareness. The cabin vanished too. Only the document remained. Silver. A mineral survey. A deposit. Suddenly the northern parcel looked very different, very valuable, and perhaps that was exactly why someone had wanted control of it. Caleb looked stunned. You think there was silver on the land? I don't know, but somebody thought there might be. Jeremiah nodded slowly. And if that survey exists, then someone had a motive, Martha finished. The room fell silent again. Not because they lacked answers, because they suddenly had too many possibilities. Then another realization hit Finnick. Hard, fast, unavoidable. If Granger knew, and Sarah knew, then someone else might know too. Someone with far more influence, far more money, far more reason to keep the truth buried. Abram looked as if he had reached the same conclusion. His face had gone pale. What? Finnick asked. Abram didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. There was another visitor after Father's funeral. Every eye turned toward him. A man from Helena. Who? I never knew his name. Abram's expression tightened, but I remember what Father called him. The room went still. Even the crackling stove seemed quieter. Abram stared at the faded survey marks, then at the missing legal document, then at Finnick, and finally spoke the name that had haunted him for years. Father called him the investor. Silence crashed over the cabin, because for the first time, the mystery no longer looked like a family dispute. It looked like someone had been waiting decades for access to the northern parcel. The cabin fell silent. Even the storm seemed distant for a moment. Everyone stared at Abram, the investor, not a neighbor, not a relative, not a lawyer, someone from Helena, someone who had appeared immediately after their father's death, someone who somehow knew enough about the northern parcel to care about it. Finnick slowly sat down. His father's letter remained open beside the lantern. The survey marks, the missing inheritance clause, the altered documents, the investor. For the first time the pieces felt connected, not complete, but connected. When did he come? Finnick asked. A few days after the funeral. Abram's voice sounded distant. He met with Granger first, and then he came to the farm. What did he want? Abram looked toward the firebox. The warmth from the stove reflected across his face. He wanted information. Finnick frowned. About what? The northern parcel. Nobody moved. The answer was exactly what everyone expected, which somehow made it worse. Abram continued. He asked questions about access roads, water, boundaries, mineral rights. Jeremiah swore quietly under his breath. A blacksmith did not ask those questions. A businessman did. A man looking for value did. A man looking for profit certainly did. Martha folded her arms tighter. Did Father know? Abram nodded. He refused to meet him. The answer surprised everyone, including Finnick. His father had always been practical, always willing to listen before making decisions. Refusing a meeting outright was unusual, very unusual. Did he say why? Abram laughed bitterly. He called him a scavenger. The word lingered in the room. Scavenger, not competitor, not buyer, scavenger. Someone waiting for weakness, waiting for death, waiting for opportunity. Outside the storm intensified. Snow buried what remained of the road. The basin had effectively disappeared from the rest of the world. Inside the cabin, the mystery kept growing. A little later, Caleb approached the table. His attention returned to the documents. Something had been bothering him. I keep thinking about the trust. Everyone looked at him. If somebody wanted control of the land, they wouldn't just hide information. He tapped the incomplete page. They'd need legal authority. Jeremiah nodded. Or they'd need everyone else confused. Exactly. Finnick leaned forward. The thought made sense. Confusion protected people, but it also protected secrets, especially profitable ones. Then Caleb pointed toward the hidden metal box. Why would your father leave copies inside the stove plans? The question stopped everyone, because until that moment nobody had really addressed it. The documents themselves were important, but where they had been found was equally strange. The box had not been hidden in the cabin. It had been hidden in the future. Hidden somewhere only Finnick would eventually build. Somewhere his father should never have been able to access, unless Finnick felt a sudden realization. His eyes moved toward the stove, then toward the sketches scattered across the table, then back toward the box. Martha noticed immediately. What? Slowly, Finnick stood. The answer felt absurd, yet somehow reasonable. My father didn't hide the box in the stove. Everyone stared at him. What are you talking about? Caleb asked. Finnick crossed the room and picked up the original design sketch, the worn drawing that had traveled with him since leaving the farm. The same sketch he had used to build the masonry heater. The same drawing inspired by the old railroad mason. Or so he thought. His hands tightened around the paper. I never drew the first version. The room went silent. Martha blinked. What do you mean? It wasn't mine. Nobody spoke. Finnick carefully unfolded the oldest section. Years of handling had nearly destroyed the edges, but the original paper remained intact. He placed it beneath the lantern. For several seconds nobody understood. Then Jeremiah leaned closer. His eyes widened. The sketch contained handwriting, tiny notes, measurements, construction marks, details Finnick had always assumed belonged to the railroad mason, except one line near the corner changed everything. Martha read it first, then froze. The initials were unmistakable. FV, their father's initials, not Finnick's, his father's. A strange silence settled over the cabin. The old man had drawn the stove. Not Finnick, not the railroad mason, their father. The revelation shifted the entire story. Suddenly the hidden box made sense. The trust made sense. Even the warning letter made more sense. The stove wasn't merely a heating system. It was part of a plan, a very deliberate plan, one that had begun years before anyone realized. Abram looked stunned. I've never seen that drawing. Finnick believed him. The reaction was genuine. Whatever had happened after their father's death, Abram clearly hadn't known about this. The realization mattered, because it narrowed the circle. Some people had been manipulated. Others had done the manipulating. Those were not the same thing. Hours passed. The storm entered its third day. Outside, temperatures continued falling. Inside, the stove proved itself again and again. The masonry remained warm long after every fire. Wood consumption stayed remarkably low. Even Caleb could no longer hide his admiration, neither could Jeremiah. For months they had mocked the project. Now they sat beside it, alive because of it. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Late that evening another problem emerged. Not from the weather, from Abram. He had become increasingly restless, increasingly distracted. Finally Finnick confronted him. What aren't you telling us? Abram looked away. Wrong move, everyone noticed. The room immediately grew tense. Abram, still silence. Then Martha spoke. If there's more, now is the time. Abram rubbed both hands across his face. The gesture looked less like hesitation and more like surrender. There is something. Finnick's stomach tightened. Of course there was. There always was. Abram stood and walked toward the window. Snow swirled beyond the glass. The world outside had vanished completely. When he finally turned back around, his expression had changed. The guilt was gone. Only dread remained. I lied about one thing. Nobody interrupted. Not this time. Abram looked directly at Finnick, then at the hidden box, then at the old stove sketch. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. The investor didn't come only once. The room froze. Abram swallowed. He came back the following spring. Finnick felt his pulse quicken. What happened? Abram's answer came immediately, too immediately, as if he had rehearsed it in his mind for years. He offered me money. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The storm hammered the cabin walls, and Abram slowly reached into his coat pocket, then removed a folded receipt, a receipt signed more than a year earlier, for an amount so large that every person in the room instantly understood one thing. Someone had been trying to buy the northern parcel long before Finnick ever moved onto it. The receipt passed from hand to hand around the table. Nobody needed long to understand its significance. The amount was staggering. Far beyond what ordinary ranch land could justify, far beyond what anyone would offer for rocky soil, scattered timber, and a seasonal creek. Caleb read the figure twice, then a third time. Nobody pays this kind of money unless they know something. Jeremiah nodded. Or think they know something. Abram sat heavily in his chair. The years of carrying the secret seemed to have drained him. I turned him down. Finnick looked up sharply. What happened after that? Abram stared into the stove. The masonry glowed softly in the lantern light. Heat continued radiating into the room, steady, reliable, everything the conversation was not. The investor kept coming back. Nobody interrupted. He never pressured me directly, never threatened me, never demanded anything. Finnick's stomach tightened. Those kinds of men rarely did. They just waited. Abram nodded. Exactly. The answer carried more weight than any accusation. Waiting, watching, looking for weakness. The same word their father had used. Outside, the blizzard entered another brutal phase. Snow buried what remained of the collapsed shed, wind screamed across the basin, yet, inside the cabin another storm continued unfolding, one built from choices, regrets, and buried truths. Abram rubbed his eyes. The first offer came before father's estate was finalized. He pointed toward the documents. The second came after Granger finished reviewing everything. Finnick immediately noticed something. Finished reviewing? Abram froze. Only briefly, but long enough. What? The older man hesitated, then sighed. That's when Sarah changed. The room became very still. For the first time, the story was moving beyond paperwork, beyond land, into family. Martha leaned forward. What do you mean? Abram looked exhausted. Before that, she never cared much about the northern parcel. And afterward? Afterward, she talked about it constantly. Nobody spoke, because everyone already understood what that suggested. Someone had told her something valuable, something important enough to change her behavior. Abram continued. At first I thought she was worried about money. His voice softened. We weren't struggling, but we weren't wealthy either. That part sounded believable. Every ranching family understood uncertainty. A single bad season could change everything. But then she started asking strange questions. What kind of questions? Finnick asked. Whether father had hidden records, whether he'd mentioned surveys, whether he trusted outsiders. Jeremiah swore quietly. Those weren't questions about inheritance. Those were questions about information. The distinction mattered. A lot. The stove crackled softly. Nobody moved. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. Did Granger ever meet with her privately? Abram nodded. The answer landed hard several times. Martha closed her eyes. The picture was becoming clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Finnick felt a growing frustration. Every answer seemed to reveal another layer, another person, another secret. Another reason the truth had disappeared. Then a loud bang shook the cabin. Everyone jumped. The sound came from outside. Not from the storm, from something breaking. Finnick immediately grabbed a lantern. Jeremiah followed. The two men forced open the door. Wind exploded inward. Snow blasted through the entrance. Visibility barely existed, yet they could still see the source. Part of the livestock shelter had collapsed. The remaining support beam had snapped under the weight of drifting snow. Finnick cursed under his breath. They rushed into the storm. The cold struck like a physical force. Every breath hurt. Every step fought resistance. Together they secured what remained of the structure before returning to the cabin. By the time they got back inside, ice coated their coats. Martha immediately handed them blankets. No one spoke for several minutes. The experience had reminded everyone of something important. The storm did not care about family secrets. The storm would kill them all if they stopped paying attention. Eventually the conversation resumed, but now it carried urgency, the sense that time mattered, because it did, not just for survival, for truth. Late that evening, while organizing the documents, Finnick noticed something else. A detail nobody had paid attention to before, the receipt, specifically the signature. He moved closer to the lantern, then frowned. What is it? Martha asked. Finnick pointed. The investor hadn't signed his full name, only initials, 2 letters. J.C. Caleb shrugged. That doesn't tell us much. No, Finnick continued staring. It doesn't, yet something felt familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. He couldn't explain why, only that he'd seen those initials before, somewhere, years ago. Then Jeremiah suddenly stood. His chair scraped across the floor. The movement startled everyone. What? The blacksmith's face had changed completely. He looked pale, almost shocked. You've seen them before because I have. The room froze. Finnick stared at him. What are you talking about? Jeremiah swallowed, slowly, carefully, like a man realizing he should have spoken years earlier. I repaired a lockbox for Granger once. Nobody moved. The blacksmith continued. It was heavy, expensive, the kind of thing businessmen use for documents. His eyes drifted toward the receipt. Inside was a survey map. Finnick felt his pulse quicken. Jeremiah nodded toward the initials J. C was stamped across the corner. Silence crashed into the room, because suddenly the investor wasn't just a rumor. He was real, connected, documented. Jeremiah rubbed his jaw, trying to remember, trying to reach backward through years of memory. Then another detail surfaced, one he clearly wished he had forgotten. There was a company name too. Every person in the cabin leaned forward. What company? Jeremiah closed his eyes. The answer came slowly, piece by piece. like a buried thing forcing its way to the surface. Continental Resource Holdings. Nobody recognized it, except Abram. His face went white. Instantly, violently. The reaction terrified Finnick more than the name itself, because Abram knew it, and whatever he knew he had never intended to share. Finnick stood. Abram. No answer, Abram. Finally the older man looked up. Fear filled his eyes. Real fear, the kind no storm could create. Then he whispered the words that changed everything once again. That's not a mining company. The room fell silent. Finnick's pulse thundered. Then what is it? Abram swallowed, and for the first time since the blizzard began, he looked genuinely afraid of what the answer might unleash. It's the company that bought Sarah's family ranch 6 months before she met me. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The wind battered the cabin walls. The stove continued radiating its quiet heat. Yet all attention remained fixed on Abram. Sarah's family ranch, Continental Resource Holdings, the same company, the same initials, the same shadow that had somehow followed them across years. Finnick leaned forward. What happened to her family's ranch? Abram stared at the floor. It disappeared. The answer felt too simple, too clean. Martha frowned. What do you mean, disappeared? Abram rubbed both hands together. They sold it. Voluntarily? I don't know. The uncertainty sounded genuine. Sarah always said her father regretted it afterward. Said men from the company kept showing up before the sale. Surveyors, attorneys, investors. Jeremiah exchanged glances with Caleb. Nobody liked how familiar that sounded. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A company arrived. Questions followed, surveys followed, then money. Then ownership changed hands, and afterward people regretted it. Finnick stood and walked toward the window. Darkness swallowed everything beyond the glass. He could barely see the drifting snow. His thoughts raced. For years he had believed this conflict was about land, then minerals. Now it felt larger than either, because companies did not spend decades chasing worthless property. They simply didn't. Abram broke the silence. There was one more thing. Every head turned, his expression tightened, like a man deciding whether to reveal something he should have revealed years ago. When Sarah's father was dying, he tried to tell us something. Martha's pulse quickened. What? Abram hesitated. He said our land wasn't the real target. The room became still. Finnick slowly turned away from the window. What did he mean? I don't know. Abram sounded frustrated with himself. He died before he finished. Nobody spoke. Because unfinished warnings were somehow worse than complete ones. A complete answer could be challenged. An incomplete one haunted people. Caleb finally broke the silence. What exactly did he say? Abram closed his eyes, trying to remember. He said they were looking in the wrong place. The words hung in the air. Looking in the wrong place. Finnick repeated them quietly. Then again. Each time they sounded stranger. Because if the northern parcel wasn't the target, then what was? The question followed him long after the conversation ended. Hours later, most of the cabin had settled into uneasy sleep. The storm continued outside. The stove glowed softly in the darkness. Finnick remained awake. The documents sat beside him. Receipts, survey notes, letters, estate papers. He began reading them again, more carefully. This time he wasn't looking for money, he was looking for patterns, and eventually he found one. A small one, but enough. Nearly every document referenced land ownership, mineral rights, boundary disputes, tax assessments, except one, a folded page buried near the bottom. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was correspondence, old correspondence. The paper carried his father's handwriting. Finnick immediately recognized it. His chest tightened. He unfolded the page. The letter wasn't addressed to Abram, or to him, or to any family member. It was addressed to someone named Theodore Hale. No one in the cabin recognized the name. Finnick read the first lines, then frowned. Read them again. Then a third time. The letter made no sense, at least not at first. It discussed maps, historic records, rail routes, property transfers dating back decades. None of it matched the story their father had told. Finnick kept reading. Halfway down the page, another sentence stopped him cold. If the records disappear, make sure the journal survives. His pulse jumped. Journal, not records, not deeds. A journal. He immediately carried the letter toward the lantern. Martha woke when he sat beside her. What happened? Without speaking, he handed her the page. She read the sentence, then looked up. A journal. Finnick nodded. Apparently. Jeremiah woke next, then Caleb. Within minutes, several people had gathered around the table again, sleep forgotten, the storm forgotten. Everyone focused on the letter. What journal? Caleb asked. No idea. But your father believed it mattered, enough to put it in writing. Jeremiah took the page. His brow furrowed. Then he pointed toward the date. Look, everyone leaned closer. The letter had been written nearly 20 years earlier, long before any investor appeared, long before Granger, long before Sarah. The realization changed everything. This wasn't a recent scheme. Whatever secret existed had been hidden for decades. Maybe longer. Finnick suddenly remembered something. A memory. Small, insignificant at the time, yet impossible to ignore now. There was a journal. Abram looked up. What? Finnick nodded slowly. I saw father carrying one for years. The memory sharpened. Leather cover, dark binding. Always kept separately from farm records. He remembered it because nobody else was allowed to touch it. Not even Abram. Not even family. Martha immediately noticed something else. Have you ever seen it since he died? Finnick froze. No, he hadn't. Not once. Neither had Abram. The answer hit both brothers simultaneously. The journal had vanished, just like the missing survey records. Just like Granger's hidden files. Just like every piece of evidence pointing toward the truth. Someone had removed it. Deliberately. Abram sank into a chair. The realization visibly shook him. Because only a few people could have accessed their father's belongings after his death. Very few, and one name sat above all others. Granger. No one wanted to say it first. Eventually Jeremiah did. You think Granger took it? Finnick stared at the letter. I think Granger knew it existed. The distinction mattered, because knowledge was enough. Knowledge created motive, and motive created opportunity. The storm howled across the valley. The cabin creaked. The stove remained steady. Then Martha noticed something none of the men had seen. A second sheet folded behind the first. Thin, almost hidden, she carefully separated the pages. A small photograph slid into the table. Everyone leaned closer. The image was old, very old, black and white, faded around the edges. 3 adults stood beside a rail line construction camp, 2 men. 1 woman. Finnick immediately recognized one face, their father, younger, much younger. Beside him stood a man nobody recognized. But it wasn't the people that captured Martha's attention. It was what had been written on the back. A single line, in faded ink. Property isn't what they're searching for. Find Hale before they do. Silence swallowed the room. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, because suddenly Theodore Hale was no longer just a name from a forgotten letter. He was someone their father had desperately wanted to find. And judging by the warning on the photograph, someone else had been hunting him too. Then Abram slowly reached toward the photograph. His face had gone pale, completely pale. Finnick noticed immediately. Abram? No response. Abram, what is it? The older man kept staring at the second man in the picture. His hands began trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I know him. Every person in the cabin froze. Finnick felt his heart pound. What are you talking about? Abram never looked away from the photograph. The firelight reflected in his eyes. And when he finally answered, the words changed the entire story once again. That isn't Theodore Hale. He swallowed hard. That's the man who attended father's funeral. Abram's words did not leave the cabin. They stayed there, heavy and cold, even while the masonry stove gave back its heat. Finnick stared at the old photograph. The man beside his father had attended the funeral under another name. He had come as an investor, asked about the northern parcel, and disappeared behind company papers, lawyer visits, and missing records. But now the pattern was clear. The land had never been the whole secret. The secret was proof. Theodore Hale had not been a buyer, he had been a witness. Years earlier, he and Finnick's father had worked near the rail line and discovered survey records showing that Continental Resource Holdings had been quietly buying poor families out of land before mineral reports became public. Hale had kept a journal with names, maps, and payments. Finnick's father had hidden copies where only a careful man would eventually find them. Not in a bank. Not in a lawyer's office. In the plans for a stove built on the one piece of land the company still needed. By the 5th day of the blizzard, the cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a room full of witnesses. Jeremiah remembered the lockbox. Caleb remembered men asking about creek access years earlier. Silas admitted Continental had once offered him money to report which homesteads were struggling. Abram placed the investor's receipt beside the altered inheritance page and did not look away from what it proved. He had not created the lie alone, but he had benefited from it. That was the part he could no longer escape. When the storm finally weakened, no one rushed home. The roads were buried, the basin damaged, and several cabins had gone dark before their owners reached safety. People moved carefully through the aftermath, helping neighbors first. Only when the living were accounted for did Finnick wrap the documents in oilcloth and ride with Abram, Jeremiah, and Caleb toward town. Harold Granger was still in his office when they arrived. He looked older than Finnick remembered, but not weak. Men like Granger rarely looked weak. They looked respectable. That was how they survived. At first he denied everything. He said old papers were often incomplete. He said memories changed in grief. He said no court would care about half-burned copies, faded impressions, or storm stories from exhausted men. Then Jeremiah placed the receipt on his desk. Caleb placed the photograph beside it. Abram placed the missing page down last. Granger stopped talking. That was the first real confession. The full truth took weeks to verify. Nothing happened in a single dramatic moment. County records had to be searched. Witness statements had to be taken. Continental's filings in Helena had to be compared against old land transfers. The process was slow, frustrating, and deeply human. But this time, Finnick did not stand alone. Granger eventually admitted enough to ruin himself. He had concealed part of the trust, advised Abram to treat the northern parcel as ordinary inheritance, and shared survey information with Continental through private correspondence. Sarah had known more than Abram wanted to believe. She had not written the scheme, but she had pushed it forward, hoping the company that swallowed her family's ranch might now make her powerful instead of ashamed. The consequences came in pieces. Granger lost his position and faced civil claims from more than one family. Continental's purchase efforts were frozen while investigators reviewed prior transfers. Sarah left the main farm before spring and returned only once, not to apologize, but to collect what the law allowed her to take. Abram did not stop her. He had spent years letting other people steer him. That ended there. The northern parcel remained Finnick's, not because it was rich, not because silver made him important, because the truth finally did. The mineral deposit proved smaller than rumors had suggested, enough to explain Continental's greed but not enough to turn poor men into kings. That almost relieved Finnick. He had never wanted the land because of what might be buried beneath it. He wanted it because his father had trusted him to understand what others dismissed. That spring Abram came to the cabin with a wagon full of stone. He did not bring speeches, he did not bring excuses, he brought tools. Finnick stood in the yard and watched him unload the first block. For a long time neither brother spoke. The old anger was still there, so was the damage. One winter could expose the truth, but it could not erase every wound. Finally Abram looked toward the giant brick stove inside the cabin. I should have listened. Finnick considered the words. Then he picked up a trowel and handed it to him. Then listen now. That was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning with weight behind it. Together they built a smaller masonry heater at the main farm. Jeremiah forged the doors and dampers. Caleb built one in his own cabin before the next winter. Silas changed how he stored and sold wood, teaching families to season fuel before desperation arrived. Martha kept the silver pocket watch on the mantle, not because they had recovered what was lost, but because she had chosen what mattered before the world understood why. Finnick kept his father's letter in a locked box near the stove, where heat could not damage it, but memory could still reach it. Years later, people in Judith Basin still talked about the blizzard of 1889. They remembered the cold, the buried roads, and the cabins that failed. But those who had lived through it remembered some things too. They remembered a man mocked for preparing. They remembered a brother who came to his door with pride frozen out of him. And they remembered that the giant brick stove had not only held warmth, it had held the truth. If this story stayed with you, share what you think Finnick should have done about Abram. And if you believe some truths are worth protecting for years, leave your thoughts in the comments.